Despite efforts in Britain and France to emphasize in the 1930s the importance of imperial unity and the advantages they enjoyed from empire in all its many forms, overseas territory remained a source of persistent insecurity, both internal and external. Arab protest continued in the Middle East mandates and French North Africa. Britain conceded self-government to the Iraq Mandate in 1932, though British informal control continued. Conceded an Anglo-Egyptian treaty in 1936 that confirmed virtual independence and joint control of the Suez Canal, and maintained two divisions in Palestine to cope with Arab insurgency and violence between Arab and Jewish populations. The conflict in Palestine was the largest military undertaking by British forces between the wars, and the tough repression of the insurgency resulted in at least 5,700 Arab dead and 21,700 seriously injured, imprisonment without trial, and a blind eye to torture by the security forces. In India, following a wave of riots and assassinations, the British used civil martial law to allow them to imprison nationalist and communist opponents during periods of heightened tension. A total of 80,000 political prisoners between 1930 and 1934. Strikes and protests were met with volleys of shots. At Kanpur in March 1931, 141 were killed. In Karachi in March 1935, 47 more. India was eventually granted a limited measure of self-government in 1935, which enfranchised only 15% of the population and failed to satisfy the majority Congress Party's demand for full independence. There was widespread strike activity and labor protests in African and Caribbean colonies, badly affected by the economic slump in Tanganyika, northern Rhodesia, Gold Coast, and Trinidad. In the African Copper Belt, workers were shot and killed in a wave of strikes in the middle of the decade, while in Barbados, popular protest against economic hardship in 1937 left 14 dead from gunshots and bayonets. Much of the protests from poor workers and farmers was blamed on local communist movements, which all imperial powers fought against with harsh programs of exile, imprisonment, and police repression. But there were also political movements representing the nationalist aspirations that had emerged in 1919, some of which were appeased with limited sovereignty, as in Iraq or Egypt, and some challenged with summary arrest, the suppression of anti-imperial organizations and publications, and, in the French case, a state of siege declared throughout the empire in 1939. Communism, as an international movement, was ideologically committed to campaigns to end colonial empire, which explains British and French anxiety. When the British Air Ministry began to plan the ideal long range bomber in the mid 1930s, its range was not based on the threat from Germany, but on a possible war with the Soviet Union, whose cities and industries could be hit from Empire air bases. Long range would also contribute to what was called Empire reinforcement against a Soviet threat. Fear of communism also explains the ambivalent attitude taken towards the Spanish Civil War, where Britain and France pursued a formal policy of non intervention rather than supporting the democratic Republican government. Given the widespread popular fear of a general war, and the manifold problems of holding together global empires that were difficult to defend adequately against external threats and internal political protest, the reduction of risk became a central component of both British and French strategy in the 1930s. This avoidance of risk is usually defined by the term appeasement, but it is an unfortunate term, as one of its proponents, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, later remarked. Appeasement has become the lightning conductor for a long line of critical and hostile analysis of Western behavior in the face of dictatorship, and a watchword for any current failure to act with firmness against any threat to Western security. Yet, as a description of British and French strategy in the 1930s, it is highly misleading. In the first place, the term implies a commonality of interest between both states and between the officials, politicians, and soldiers responsible for making strategic judgments. In reality, policy was never monolithic but reflected a variety of assumptions, hopes, and expectations, which changed in reaction to circumstances, while policymakers employed a wide range of possible options in order to preserve the key elements of Anglo French strategy: imperial security, economic strength, and domestic peace. It is more useful in many respects to describe this strategy in the terms made more familiar in the age of the Cold War 20 years later: containment and deterrence. The record of both states in their approach to international problems in the 1930s was never simply a spineless abdication of responsibility, but a prolonged, if sometimes incoherent, effort to square the circle of growing international instability and their own desire to protect the imperial status quo.